Okay, so we're going to talk about fishing and aquatic food production systems, and this is going to link us into sustainability. So first of all, let's think about terrestrial food production systems compared to aquatic food production systems, and particularly with regards to how efficient they are. So by efficient, I mean how well do they transfer energy between the different food levels. If we look at the phytoplankton in an aquatic food system, so phytoplankton are going to be our producers fixing the sun's energy. However, a lot of the sun's energy gets scattered at this stage, so not all of it reaches the producers, whereas much more reaches the producers in a terrestrial one. Then the energy is passed up the food chain, and one of the things you'll notice is that in an aquatic food chain there can actually be a longer food chain, and this is because the efficiency is greater. So even though we start with less energy here at the phytoplankton, as it's passed from organism to organism there's more efficiency. And why is that? Because less energy goes into support and body structures. The water actually reduces the amount of energy that organisms have to expend, so they have more energy to pass on to the predator. We waste a lot of this energy when we fish. So when we fish, we actually catch a lot of fish and don't use it all, so our efficiency is very, very low. So if we're comparing the efficiency of aquatic and terrestrial food production systems, these are a couple of different things that we can talk about. So one of the things we have to think about in aquatic food production systems, and we're mostly talking about fish here, is the fish stocks and how we can sustainably harvest fish and sea life from the oceans. Really, fishing is the last kind of hunting in the wild. We don't, although we have bushmeat, we don't really, as human beings, hunt from the wild anymore, and apart from taking fish from the ocean. So we're going to look at the Peruvian anchovy. This is a famous case study. The Peruvian anchovy is now not an endangered species, but a scarce species, and fishing it is banned. It's a small species, it matures in a year, and it lives off the coast of Peru and northern Chile. The cold currents that upwell from the seabed bring lots of nutrients for phytoplankton. Under normal circumstances, cold water won't rise. Only hot water rises. Cold water is dense and sinks to the bottom. But as this, because of the nature of the ocean currents as they reach the Peruvian coastline, the cold water is pushed up against the sort of wall of landmass that is Peru, and that brings all those nutrients up from the seafloor bed. So we've got plankton at the base of the food chain. Here's a picture of the ocean currents. So this is north and south, here's Peru, and so the currents push up against the landmass here. Here's a good picture. So what's normally happening is that these currents come up here, so they're pushing. The wind at the top here is coming off of the mass continent of South America, pushing the ocean in this direction. And this sort of causes a bulge over on the Western Pacific Ocean. So that leaves a void over here, okay, near to America, and then the water is going to rise to fill that void. So it's the wind pushing, the water is heating up across the ocean, cold water is down below, but it's having to rise up to fill this void left by the wind. As I said before, the cold water brings nutrients, because this is where everything is rotting down here on the sea floor. And oxygen and other gases also dissolve more easily in cold water, so it's going to be plenty oxygen, we've got sunlight, we've got nutrients, and the chlorophyll and the phytoplankton is just going to thrive up here. So the food webs are going to thrive, and so we've got this massive fishery. Here's another diagram of the same thing. Sorry, I'll flip back for you. Okay, so big trench, big deep ocean here, and then this pushing up here, coastal waters being pushed by the wind back out. So the Peruvian anchovy, as we said, it's a primary consumer, it's our selected species, and just harvested in massive amounts. One of the richest fisheries in the world. In 1972, there was an El Niño event that brought warm tropical water into the area. For the geographers among you, you'll know that an El Niño event is when those winds are reversed. So the wind is no longer blowing the warm ocean water across the Pacific, so there's no longer a void to be filled, and the cold water no longer rises. What impacts do you think this would have had on the anchovies, and why? You need to pause the video and write some of this down. Write down now some of your ideas about what impacts it would have had. That would be a good idea. So the upwelling would have stopped, and this would have stopped the phytoplankton growth because now there's not as many nutrients, the water's warmer, so it doesn't contain as much oxygen. This would cause the anchovy numbers to fall. And as they fell, they crashed, and the small numbers of anchovies were harvested by the fisheries because fishing continued as usual. There was a massive impact put on it. And even larger catches were made. No quotas were put on the fishery because there wasn't a great awareness about the impacts this was going to have. And ultimately, the fishery absolutely crashed. Worldwide, fisheries are suffering, and this is because it's very, very hard to impose quotas. Even though in some places there are quotas, unless people can be out there on the boats observing, there's going to be uncontrolled harvesting. Fishing industry are going to harvest as much as they possibly can. Sometimes the quotas are unrealistic and inflexible, driving fishermen into poverty, driving them bankrupt, and their simply only option is to either ignore the quotas or starve for their own families. We don't have enough data on fish populations. How are we supposed to set those quotas if we don't know much about the populations? And I'll go into this in a little bit when I talk about calculating sustainable yield. We've got better and better technologies in the fishing industries. We have sensors that can detect shoals of fish. We have technologies that allow, that kind of encourage fish to cluster in one place so that they can be easily harvested. We have more effective nets, so they're more effective at scooping up a lot of fish. They're not more efficient because a lot of those fish we don't eat. We just dies and we toss it back. And the result of all of this is that fish populations are reduced below their recovery level. There are some estimates that suggest that in the next 50 years we will no longer have fisheries. We will no longer be eating seafood. As I mentioned, you've got lots of bycatch. Bycatch are the organisms that are caught and not actually eaten. Other species like seabirds are then deprived of a food resource, and so we're having all these impacts on the ecosystem and the food chains. And now we've got total ban on some species. Peruvian anchovy, as we've talked about, Pacific salmon, Newfoundland Grand Banks cod, and North Sea herring. Growing up, I had herring all the time. Fish and chips, it was always herring. Now it's cod. It's probably something else since the last time I've been back to the UK, because we're slowly working our way through our fish stocks. So none of this is very sustainable. Sustainability, as you'll recall, means living within the means of nature on the natural income generated by natural capital. And it is use of global resources at a rate that allows natural regeneration and minimizes damage to the environment. We need to let our resources grow back, and then we can harvest them so that we're not touching our capital, we're not touching our resources that we've stored in the bank. So we have this calculation, maximum sustainable yield. How much is it that we can actually take from the environment without harming it? And fisheries use this a lot. So that's why we've put it into the lecture on fisheries. It's based upon the harvest rate. So how much are we actually going to take? How many new fish are entering the population? So not so much through migration, but through birth. A population can be harvested at the point in their population growth rate where it is highest. That is when the rate is highest, the exponential phase of the growth rate. We can harvest it when it gets to that point, but we need to let it grow a little bit first. The harvesting, what we take out, has to balance with what's going in, with the recruitment. So the young fish that are entering into the system, and that's not baby fish, that is fish that are of mature enough age that they can reproduce, that needs to balance our harvest. The fixed fishing quotas, so if I tell you that you can fish 20 tons of fish in the next month, that's going to produce a constant harvesting rate. And we'll get into this in a moment. This is a problem because there isn't going to be a constant rate. It's going to fluctuate depending on environmental conditions and on natural population fluctuations. Okay, how do we calculate sustainable yield? It's very simple actually. The sustainable yield is the total biomass, like how much we have at time plus 1. Let's say how much biomass I have next week minus how much biomass I have this week. So next week, if I've got, if I grow 5 tomato plants, and right now I have no tomatoes, and next week I have like 100 grams of tomatoes, then the sustainable yield is going to be 100 grams. It can't be more than that because I'll be cutting into my actual tomato plants. Okay, we can measure this in energy instead of mass, or we can just look and see how much is the population growing. So this is actually growth as in like physical growth, and how many new individuals do we have, minus how many we're losing and are moving out. So we could think about it in that way as well. Another definition is it is the carrying capacity. So remember, here's our growth phase, right? So it starts off and we haven't got very many fish, and then they're reproducing and increasing, and those are reproducing and increasing, and it starts to become a faster and faster rate of increase. And then we get into this exponential phase. Once we get into the exponential phase, that is when we can harvest, and that's why we've got this line here. Okay, if I harvest at this point, right, if I harvest all of them, there's going to be no more to grow up and to reach carrying capacity, and there's going to be no more to keep recruiting. I have to start from scratch and let it all build up again. So how many can I actually harvest? We estimate that it is the carrying capacity divided by 2. So that's going to be about here. So this population size is what I can harvest. Okay, this has actually come from an exam question, an old exam question that was multiple choice. So sustainable yield can be defined as what? Well, we've already said it is annual growth and recruitment minus annual death and emigration. Yes, so we can define it like that. So definitely number 1. Number 2, the gain in biomass or energy per unit time remaining after subtracting metabolic and other natural losses. So we're thinking about how much mass, how much stuff do I have after a time period. I can harvest that amount. So if my fish grows by a kilo, I can harvest a kilo of fish after a set period of time. and the highest rate at which natural capital can be exploited without reducing its original stock. So here's a descriptive way of talking about sustainable yield. So the answer is 1, 2, and 3. So 1 and 2, we can think about it mathematically. We can think about it in terms of growth and recruitment. We can think about it in terms of gains in biomass. Or we can just think about it in terms of natural capital and how much we can harvest without impacting our natural stock. So going back to our bank analogy for capital and income, the natural capital is like the amount of money you put in the bank. Now, if you put 1,000,000 baht in the bank and you get an annual output of 20,000 baht of interest, and every year you only spend 20,000 baht, you will always have your 1,000,000 baht in the bank. That's never going to change, and every single year you get 20,000 baht to live on. You can spend that 20,000 baht, but if you start spending your 1,000,000 baht, you start cutting into that, the following year you'll have less than 20,000. It's no longer going to be sustainable. This is the exact same thing when it comes to harvesting animals. We don't want to tap into our stock, into our capital. We only want to live on the interest, which we call the natural income. All right, there's some problems with maximum sustainable yields, and if there weren't, we could just harvest away and we would be living sustainably and we wouldn't have problems with fisheries. First of all, if we just harvest everything, ignoring age structure, then we are going to mess up because we need our reproductive individuals to stay in the population. If the limiting factors in the environment change, so does the population growth rate. So, for example, a limiting factor might be the amount of food available. What if something happens to the phytoplankton, for the fish, or to some other element that limits the population, like a disease? Suddenly that's going to change the carrying capacity of the environment. It's going to cause the carrying capacity to drop. And we've mentioned before that fixed quotas, so the law says you're allowed to take this many fish, suddenly that's not going to be adaptable to that situation. And then not only that, but where are we going to get this data from? I mean, population genetics does allow us. There is lots of work going on all over the world looking at population size and age structure and where the population occurs. And the genetics nowadays actually allows us to be able to make these estimations. But, you know, that costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of time. So it's slow work. And obviously then the populations are changing from underneath our feet. What do we need to do about it then? We need nets with bigger mesh size because first of all we need to let the smaller fish go so that they're not being caught. We need to regulate our fishing methods, and this is very, very difficult. Oceans are hard to manage, they're hard to monitor. We put observers on fishing boats, but the observers are almost antagonistic. They're acting not in the interest of the fishing boat. So imagine yourself out on a fishing boat. You're the person who has to report back to the government whether the boat is following the rules, and you're there with a host of fishermen. There was recently a friend of mine who was murdered on a fishing boat, and he was an observer. So this is a very difficult thing to carry out. More data on fish populations. So perhaps mark and recapture. We could tie in our population studies in there. But as I said, that nowadays this is mostly done through the investigations on mitochondrial DNA and other genetic methods. But it's expensive and difficult. We need to keep our eye on environmental factors like El Nino events, things that could affect the carrying capacity. Policing a fishing industry. So in addition to setting the regulations, we then need to make sure that they're carried out, and I've mentioned the difficulties there. These regulations and policing need to be agreed upon internationally because we're fishing in international waters. We can do more fish farming, but this is very controversial in itself. There's problems with space. Are we going to deforest a mangrove area in order to put a fish farm in? There's problems with diseases. There's problems with the chemicals, the antibiotics, the fertilizers, the foods, all of this stuff that we put into the water that are associated with fish farming, culturing fish. Okay, so now I'd like you to have a go at the practice question. This is similar to any exam question you might get. It's comparing a high-intensity fishing policy with a low one and looking at sustainable yields. And you can log on to the next video in order to see me go through this question.